The year is late 1944. The exact date is lost to the chaos of war, somewhere in the freezing grip of a Prussian November. The Third Reich, once a sprawling beast devouring Europe, is now a wounded animal, backed into a corner, lashing out with desperate, high-tech fury. The skies above Germany are no longer theirs. By day, the Americans turn the industrial centers into dust. By night, the British RAF scorches the earth. But the ground war, that is a different story. Deep inside the shrinking borders of the Reich, in the shadows of the bombed-out cathedrals and the soot-stained factories, a silent war is being fought. This is not a war of divisions and tank battalions. It is a war of individuals. It is a war of whispered passwords, of knives in the dark, and of secrets that weigh more than the rubble of Berlin. Captain Elias Thorne, an operative of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, moved through the streets of Spandau with the calculated invisibility of a ghost. To the weary German civilians shuffling past him, their heads bowed against the sleet, he was nothing. He was just another piece of human debris washed up by the tides of war. His cover identity was Johann Krenz, a dock worker from Hamburg whose home had been vaporized by an incendiary bomb, leaving him with a fake limp and papers declaring him unfit for service on the Eastern Front. The limp was an act, constant, rhythmic deception that required immense concentration to maintain, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The papers in his pocket were masterpieces of forgery, crafted by the best engravers in London, aged with tea and rubbed with ash to look worn. But Thorne knew that in this city, a single hesitation, a single wrong syllable, would mean a bullet in the back of the neck. The mission was not sabotage. Sabotage was loud. Sabotage brought the Gestapo down like a pack of wolves. This was extraction. Pure, surgical intelligence gathering. The target was Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a senior ballistics engineer at the Piemont Research Facility. Vogel was one of the brains behind the Virgil-Tungswaffe II, the V-2 rocket, the silent killer that was currently falling on London faster than the speed of sound. Vogel had seen his science twisted into mass murder, and his conscience had finally broken through the indoctrination. He had signaled his intent to defect, offering the one thing the Allies needed most, the guidance system calibration schematics. Without them, the V-2 was a blunt instrument. With them, the Allies could predict launch trajectories and hunt the mobile launchers before they fired. Thorne reached the Spandau railyard. It was a cathedral of industry, a sprawling maze of iron and steam. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of sulphurous coal smoke, freezing rain, and the metallic tang of unrefined oil. Locomotives hissed like dying dragons, venting steam that obscured the dim, blue-tinted blackout lights. Thorne approached the workers' entrance. The guards were a mix of the Volkssturm, old men in ill-fitting uniforms, and Hitler Youth boys who looked at everyone with fanatical, dangerous suspicion. Thorne didn't look away. That was a sign of guilt. He looked right through them, coughing a wet, hacking cough that rattled deep in his chest. He held out his papers with a hand stained with grease. The old guard, shivering in his greatcoat, barely glanced at the photo. He waved Thorne through, eager to avoid the sick man. Inside the yard, the noise was a physical assault. The clanging of hammers, the screech of metal wheels on icy tracks, the shouting of foremen trying to meet impossible quotas. Thorne moved towards the maintenance sheds, Sector 4. He checked his watch. 1900 hours. He was on time. He found a spot in the shadows, behind a stack of rusted wheel axles, and waited. Waiting was 90% of the job. You waited in the rain, in the snow, in the mud. You waited while your mind replayed every possible way you could die in the next 5 minutes. Thorne felt the weight of the Fairburn Sykes fighting knife tucked into the custom sheath sewn into the lining of his coat. It was a comforting weight, a reminder that he was not helpless. 10 minutes passed. Then, a figure appeared near the water tower. A man in a gray wool coat and a fedora that looked too expensive for a railyard. It was Vogel. He looked terrified. He was pacing, checking his watch every 10 seconds, his breath pluming in the cold air. Thorne scanned the perimeter. He looked for the telltale signs of a trap. The man reading a newspaper in the dark, the car idling with its lights off, the sudden silence of the workers. Everything seemed normal, but Thorne's instinct, honed by 2 years of operations behind enemy lines, was screaming at him. Something was wrong. He stepped out of the shadows, lighting a cigarette. The flare of the match illuminated the scar on his cheek, a souvenir from a knife fight in occupied France. He walked towards Vogel, dragging his left leg. "Do you have a light?" Thorne asked in German, pitching his voice to the rough, guttural dialect of the northern coast. Vogel jumped, nearly dropping his briefcase. He stared at Thorne, his eyes wide and glassy. I don't smoke," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "A pity," Thorne replied, completing the code. "The fire keeps the cold away." Vogel exhaled, a sound that was half sob, half relief. "Thank God. I thought you weren't coming. I thought they knew." He reached into his coat, his hands trembling so violently he could barely undo the buttons. He pulled out a rolled-up newspaper, the Berliner Morgenpost. It's inside, the fuel flow charts, the gyroscope settings, and the list of the new launch sites in The Hague. It's all there. Thorne took the newspaper. It felt heavy. He didn't check it. There was no time. He slid it into the deep interior pocket of his coat. "Good. Listen to me carefully. Go to the workers' latrine behind Shed B. Wait there for 10 minutes. Then leave through the south gate. Do not look back. Do not run." I can't," Vogel whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "They're watching me. I know it." Before Thorne could answer, the world turned white. Floodlights, positioned on the roofs of the maintenance sheds, snapped on simultaneously, bathing the yard in a blinding, harsh glare. The shadows vanished. They were exposed like insects under a microscope. "Halt! Stehen bleiben! Stop! Stay where you are!" The voice boomed from loudspeakers, distorted and deafening. Then came the sound of bolts racking, the distinct, mechanical clack of MP-40 submachine guns being readied. From behind the trains, figures emerged. Not the old men of the gate guard. These were the Gestapo, flanked by SS shock troops in combat gear. They had been waiting. Vogel screamed. It was a sound of pure, primal panic. He turned and ran, slipping on the oil-slicked cobblestones, scrambling away from Thorne. "No," Thorne hissed, reaching out. But Vogel was already gone, running blindly into the open. "Fire!" the order came. The air ripped apart. A burst of machine gun fire echoed off the steel trains. Vogel's body jerked violently as the bullets impacted, tearing through his heavy coat. He spun around, a look of utter confusion on his face, before collapsing onto the wet tracks. The newspaper he had held, the decoy, fluttered into a puddle, instantly soaking up the oil and blood. Thorne didn't freeze. The death of the asset was a failure, but the mission, the intelligence, was safe in his pocket. Now the mission was survival. He raised his hand slowly, blinking against the glare of the searchlights. He needed them to hesitate. He needed them to see a crippled worker, not an American commando. "Hands on your head. Walk forward." The lead officer stepped into the light, a Luger pointed at Thorne's chest. He was smiling, the cruel, arrogant smile of a hunter who has trapped his prey. Thorne limped forward, exaggerating the drag of his leg. He hunched his shoulders, making himself look smaller, weaker. He saw the officer relax slightly. The German lowered his gun a fraction of an inch, confident that this was just a terrified laborer caught in a bad deal. That fraction was all Thorne needed. When he was 3 steps away, Thorne exploded. He didn't just drop the act. He weaponized it. He kicked a spray of gravel and dirty slush into the officer's face. As the man flinched, blinding him for a microsecond, Thorne lunged. He moved with a speed that defied his bulky coat. His left hand clamped over the Luger slide, pushing it offline, while his right palm struck the officer's chin with enough force to dislocate the jaw. The gun went off, the shot going wild into the sky. Thorne wrenched the weapon free, spun the officer around, and used him as a human shield. "Down!" screamed the other soldiers, holding their fire to avoid hitting their commander. Thorne fired 2 shots, not at the soldiers, but at the searchlight above them. Glass shattered, raining down like diamonds. Darkness rushed back in, chaotic and saving. Thorne shoved the dazed officer toward the troops and Dove. He hit the ground rolling, scrambling under the carriage of a massive freight train, just as the air was filled with the angry buzz of bullets. Sparks flew as lead hit the steel wheels inches from his head. He was in the belly of the beast now. Thorne crawled through the grease and grime, moving deeper into the maze of the railyard. He could hear the shouts, the barking of dogs. They were closing the net. He needed an exit, and he needed it fast. He emerged on the far side of the yard, near the active tracks. A freight train was moving, gathering speed. It was a supply train, heading south towards Dresden, and then perhaps to the Czech border. It was his only chance. He sprinted, his lungs burning in the freezing air. The train was moving fast now, the metal clanking rhythmically. He grabbed the icy iron ladder of a boxcar. The jolt nearly tore his arm from its socket, but he held on, swinging his body against the side of the wooden car. He climbed up and rolled onto the roof, flattening himself against the cold metal as the train passed under a bridge. He wasn't safe yet. He was just moving. The journey south was a descent into a different kind of hell. The wind on top of the train was a physical bludgeoning, stripping away body heat within minutes. Thorne found an unlocked ventilation hatch and dropped into the boxcar. It was pitch black inside, smelling of raw timber and sawdust. He huddled in the corner, shivering uncontrollably. He took out the notebook. Even in the dark, he could feel the texture of the leather. This book contained a map to save thousands of lives in London. If he died, the book died with him. He couldn't let that happen. He used his knife to pry up a loose floorboard in the corner of the wagon. Beneath was the steel undercarriage. He wrapped the notebook in his oilskin cap and wedged it into the small, dark space between the wood and the steel frame. If he was captured, if he was stripped and searched, the intel would remain hidden. Maybe another agent could retrieve it. Maybe the resistance would find it. Hours bled into one another. The train slowed. Brakes screeched. Thorne peered through the cracks in the wood. A checkpoint. He saw the dreaded black uniforms of the SS. They were walking down the line of cars, banging on the doors, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They had dogs, Alsatians, trained to smell fear and foreign sweat. Thorne knew he couldn't stay inside. The dogs would alert on him in seconds. He had to go up. He climbed back to the roof, the metal slick with ice. The train had stopped. He lay flat, trying to become two-dimensional. Below, he heard the heavy slide of the boxcar door opening. "Clear," a soldier shouted. Then the dog barked. It was barking at the ceiling. "Check the roof," came the command. Thorne looked around wildly. To his right, a row of telegraph poles ran parallel to the tracks. The train was stationary. The jump was impossible, too far. But staying was a death sentence. He waited. The train gave a lurch, the couplings banging as the engine engaged. It started to creep forward. The soldier was climbing the ladder at the rear of the car. Thorne saw the top of a helmet appear. He stood up, balanced on the icy, moving roof like a surfer on a wave of steel. He sprinted towards the front of the car and leaped. For a second, he was flying. Then he hit the telegraph pole. The impact knocked the wind out of him. He wrapped his arms and legs around the wet wood, sliding down uncontrollably. Splinters tore at his clothes and skin. He hit the ground hard, rolling into a ditch filled with freezing mud and brambles. Above him, the train gathered speed. He saw the flashlight beam sweeping the roof where he had been just seconds ago. The soldiers shouted something, but the wind snatched the words away. Thorne lay motionless in the mud, half buried, letting the freezing water soak him. He waited until the caboose passed. He had to get back on. The book was still on the train. Adrenaline is a powerful drug. It masked the pain in his ribs and the numbness in his fingers. As the end of the train passed, Thorne scrambled out of the ditch. He ran. He ran until his heart felt like it would explode. He caught the rear railing of the last car, his fingers hooking onto the cold iron. He hauled himself up, collapsing onto the small platform at the back of the train. He was back on, but he couldn't stay. He had to retrieve the book and jump before the next major station. He made his way back across the roofs, a perilous journey in the dark, jumping the gaps between the swaying cars. He found his wagon, drop back in, and retrieve the package. It was dry. 20 miles from the Czech border. The train slowed for a sharp curve through the dense black forest. Thorne didn't wait for a stop. He jumped into the darkness. He landed in a snowbank, tumbling over and over, the world spinning. When he stopped, silence rushed back in. The absolute, heavy silence of the forest. The next 12 hours were a test of human endurance. The black forest was ancient, dark, and unforgiving. Thorne moved tactically, stepping on rocks and tree roots to leave no footprints in the snow. He could hear patrols in the distance, trucks on the logging roads, occasionally the baying of hounds. He rubbed pine needles and dirt into his clothes to mask his scent. He ate snow to stay hydrated. He didn't sleep. To sleep was to freeze. He thought of home, not the training camps in Scotland, but the diner in Ohio where he used to have coffee before the war. He held on to that image. It was the tether that kept him sane. By dawn, the trees thinned. Ahead lay an abandoned farmhouse, its roof sagging, looking like a ruin. This was the safe house. Code name, Valkyrie. Thorne approached with his weapon drawn. Trust no one. That was the first rule. He knocked on the back door using the rhythm. 3 hard knocks, pause, 2 soft knocks. The door creaked open. An old woman stood there, holding a double-barreled shotgun. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "The wanderer returns?" she asked in German. "Only when the wind blows from the west," Thorne replied, his voice raspy. She lowered the gun. "Come in. Quickly." Inside, the farmhouse was warm. It smelled of boiling cabbage and stale tobacco. In the corner, a young man with headphones was hunched over a suitcase radio. He was tapping out Morse code with a frantic rhythm. He stopped and looked up. "London acknowledges," the operator said. "Extraction approved. Operation Moonlight. A Lysander will be at Field 4 at 0100 hours. We have to signal with flares." Thorne slumped into a chair. He had the book. He had a way out. But the hardest part was yet to come. The landing strip was a muddy field in the middle of enemy territory. Night fell like a shroud. Thorne and the resistance fighters moved to the field. The moon was full, illuminating the snow-covered ground. It was beautiful and deadly. They waited. The cold was biting, gnawing at Thorne's bones. Then they heard it. The low, throaty hum of a single engine. A Westland Lysander. The spy taxi. It was coming in low, skimming the treetops to avoid radar. "Light them up," Thorne ordered. The resistance fighters lit the flares, marking a makeshift runway in the snow. The plane banked sharply, its silhouette dark against the stars. It dropped its landing gear, descending rapidly. Suddenly, the tree-lane erupted. Machine gun fire, bright green tracers, zipped across the field. A German patrol had followed them. Ambush! Thorne yelled, dropping to one knee and returning fire with his stolen Luger. The resistance fighters opened up with their shotguns and old rifles, a desperate attempt to suppress the enemy. The Lysander didn't abort. The pilot was insane or brave or both. The plane bounced onto the frozen field, mud spraying. It taxied towards Thorne, the engine roaring, the propeller wash creating a blizzard of snow. Thorne ran. He ran through the crossfire. Bullets kicked up snow around his boots. He could hear the distinct crack thump of rounds hitting the fuselage of the plane. He reached the cockpit. The canopy slid back. A hand reached out. A British pilot in a leather helmet. "Ticket, please," the pilot shouted over the roar of the engine. Thorne threw the satchel with the notebook into the back, then grabbed the strut and hauled himself up. As he tumbled into the rear seat, a bullet shattered the glass canopy inches from his face. "Go. Get us out of here." Thorne screamed, slamming the canopy shut. The pilot gunned the engine. The Lysander lurched forward, sluggish in the mud. It picked up speed, the tail lifting. The tree-lane was rushing towards them. The German soldiers were breaking cover, running into the field, firing wildly. The plane shuddered and lifted off. They cleared the trees by feet, the landing gear brushing the topmost branches. Thorne looked down. The flares were burning out. The figures of the resistance fighters were retreating into the woods. He didn't know if they would survive the night. He would never know. They climbed into the dark sky, banking west towards France and freedom. Thorne leaned his head back against the vibrating metal of the fuselage. He touched his chest pocket. The notebook was there. The secrets of the V-2 rocket were going to London. He looked out at the landscape below, a patchwork of darkness and distant fires. This was the Shadow War. It wasn't about parades or medals. It was about men like Vogel dying in a dirty railyard. It was about the old woman with the shotgun. It was about the cold, the fear, and the silence. Elias Thorne closed his eyes for the first time in 48 hours. The engine drone was a lullaby. He was just a ghost returning to the world of the living, carrying a secret that would help end the nightmare. Stories like this happened every night during the war. Thousands of brave men and women operated in the shadows, their names unknown, their sacrifices unrecorded. If you want to dive deeper into the real, declassified files of WW2's most secret missions, and hear the stories the history books often leave out, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We are just scratching the surface of the archives. This is WW2 Shadow Operations. Over and out.